From the 1940s on, cars have symbolized status, independence, freedom, adulthood, and fun for generations of Americans. We've redesigned our cities, our restaurants, our thoroughfares to better accommodate our automobiles. A growing number of Americans now, though, are falling out of love with their cars. Car usage has declined steadily nationwide for the past 9 years. Is anyone paying attention? John Lichtenheld sure is. John is a professional engineer and a certified planner who works on transportation issues for SAA Design Associates here in Madison. Welcome to the 8 o'clock Buzz, John.
Thanks, Brian.
So your research focuses on the concept of peak car. What do you mean by peak car?
Peak car is actually, at this point, a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that the measure by which we do vehicle miles of travel is one of the measures of peak car, has actually been trending downward since about, as you mentioned, 2004.
Go ahead.
So the question out there, is this a permanent trend? In other words, are we going to bounce back when and if the economy comes back? Or are we going to continue to trend downward? Or will we flatten out and the vehicle miles of travel will actually kind of stay where they are now?
What is vehicle miles traveled? What exactly is that?
Good question. We have several indicators of how much people are traveling. And one of them is what we call vehicle miles of travel. That is the number of miles that people are actually in their automobile. And the way we measure that is actually through traffic counts. And if you'll notice, when you're out driving in the summer, you'll see those thin tubes across the highway. Those are actually measuring the number of vehicles using that particular highway. And the DOTs around the country have those out. Those are temporary. They also have permanent ones, and they aggregate those every year. They analyze them, and then they project what the impact of those vehicle miles of travel or vehicle miles are based on various trends, summer, winter, and that's the way they keep track of the vehicle miles of travel.
And that, of course, leads to funding and road construction decisions. I mean, there's a lot hinging on the statistic, right?
Yeah, the big thing with those numbers, and that's actually traffic counts on a particular corridor, is they project those out over 20 years, and then that determines how much capacity that they build into a particular roadway. And the concern right now is if we're trending downward with vehicle miles of travel and usage on roadways, then why are we projecting out over 20 or 30 years these increases in traffic counts or traffic uses of roadways? So we really need to rethink how we do and how we finance our whole transportation system.
So tell us a little bit how you got into this. I mean, it's sort of an interesting story. You were a little skeptical of some of the results that you were seeing when you were doing some of this analysis, and why were you doing this analysis to begin with?
Well, I'm a traffic engineer. I do a lot of traffic studies around the Midwest, around the state. My firm does a lot of redevelopment. We focus on older cities, particularly riverfront cities, and in my work, I was noticing, and this is a number of years ago, I was noticing that traffic volumes in these corridors were actually going down when I looked at them historically, like over the last 10 years. And I thought, well, that's because of the recession, because this was about the time, 2008, about the time of the recession. But then as I did further and further studies over the years, over the next couple of years, I noticed they weren't going down. In fact, if anything, they were decreasing. So then I started doing research. I looked at it nationally, I looked at it internationally, and what I found is that, thank goodness, it wasn't my data, but the fact was that this was happening all over the country, someplace more so than others. For example, between 2006 and 2011, in the city of Madison, the VMT, or the vehicle miles of travel, went down something like 18%. In Milwaukee, it went down 21%. So that's significant.
So we're not talking like marginal decreases here. We're talking double-digit percentage changes.
We're talking, well, some of it's subtle. Like nationally, since 2004, the VMT has gone down roughly 8.5%. So we're about the level of vehicle miles of travel. In other words, people are using their autos, and this includes commercial trucks as well, about the same level we were in 1995. So what this means, there's actually what I call a perfect storm coming, and we're seeing it already, and that is the fact that if your vehicle miles of travel are going down, you're getting more efficient use out of your automobiles, and we depend on our user fees, our gas, what we call the gas tax. So if people are using less gasoline, then guess what's happening? The revenue we use to finance that resource or finance is going down, and we can see that. The Highway Trust Fund just went bankrupt this year.
This is the state highway?
No, this is a federal highway fund. The state highway fund is already bankrupt. It's projected to have a $600 to $700 million debt next year, and it's going to be about $15 billion over the next 10 years. So what we need to do three things. Number one, we need to find another resource for our funding. The gas tax, we haven't increased the gas tax in the state of Wisconsin since 2006, nor have we increased it in the federal gas tax since 1993. So we need to find a fix for that, but quite frankly, just using the gas tax is not going to be enough long term.
Well, don't you exacerbate the problem? I mean, if people are using their cars less, and gasoline is certainly more expensive than it used to be, and you add a gas tax to that, aren't you just creating a bigger disincentive not to drive?
Well, you are, but I think you also need to look at doing a couple other things. I'd say the second priority is we need to stop building new highways. If the actual demand is going down for something, why are we building more? And thirdly, the other thing we need to do is we need to redirect our resources that we do collect in the gas tax into other modes of transportation. In other words, the modes that are increasing are what? Bicycle is increasing just not astronomically, but significantly. Bicycle use, bike paths, bike lanes, and also transit. So we need to redirect our resources into those modes of transportation that are actually increase and not into a resource that's decreasing, because our highway system right now is deteriorating. So rather than spending money on new highways, we need to focus our money on fixing what we have.
So you asked the question, why are we building new roadway expansion projects? And let me turn that around. Why is that happening in the face of this decreasing demand?
Well, I think the problem is this trend. It's a fairly recent trend. It's like an 8-year trend. And I equate bureaucracy of the federal government or the state government to a big boat. And it takes a long time to turn that boat. So what we really need to do is start focusing on that. Unfortunately, we're really not looking at it within this shorter period of time. A lot of times, as I mentioned, with traffic projections, we look back 20 years. Well, since 2008, we have a whole different scenario. We have a whole different scene with regard to development, with regard to transportation. And we need to pay attention to that rather than just looking at this long-term.
So how, and we have a great example of, as you said, state bureaucracies not paying attention to these trends. The Wisconsin Department of Transportation recently issued a press release talking about how vehicle miles traveled had gone up, and you saw some of those statistics there. What's wrong with their numbers? And then I guess the other follow-up question is, what about the road building lobby, and what is their influence in terms of trying to keep the funding stream going the way it has been for the last 30 years or so?
Well, I think if we look at the numbers that just came out with the state, they're statistics, and you can do what you want with statistics. And they put the statistics out there that we have about 60 billion vehicle miles of travel in the state of Wisconsin last year. It was actually 59.5. And then they compared it with last year, with 2012. And said there was about I believe it was a 400 million vehicle mile increase over the previous year, 2012. And then they also equated it to, I think, 45 years ago. Well, when you're looking at trends, you don't look at the last year. And when you're looking at recent trends, you don't look at the last 35 years. The other thing that's interesting is when I drill down into their numbers, yes, the vehicle miles of travel increase, but keep in mind that I mentioned before that we had a peaking of vehicle miles of travel nationwide back in 2004. The same thing was in Wisconsin. we actually had more vehicle miles of travel. We had well over 60 billion. I think we had 60.5 billion in 2004. So we're actually less in the last 10 years. We've actually decreased in vehicle miles of travel. The other thing is if you look at the breakdown, and they actually break down the vehicle miles of travel by type of facility. They look at the interstate system, they look at the state highway system, they look at the county trunk system, and they look at town roads, and then they look at municipal roads. If you look across all those categories between 2012 and 2013, you'll see that they actually decreased on the interstate, they decreased on the state highway system, and they also decreased on the municipal system. Where they really increased was on the town roads, and they increased significantly. Of that 400 million vehicle miles of travel, the town roads actually increased, and it was the only increase of about 700. So they not only covered the decrease in the other roadway classifications, but that accounted pretty much for all of the vehicle miles.
What's going on there?
That's what I'd like to know. I think we really need to drill down and see what's going on. My hypothesis, and again, this is just conjecture, is we should probably start looking in the southwest part of the state.
So let's talk sort of about what's going on with this whole trend and this whole idea. And you know, the statistics you were just citing are total vehicle miles traveled, and the population's growing, but vehicle miles traveled per capita has been really, that's the statistic that's really been dropping. So
right. Well, that's a good point. And although in those, like the last 10 years, for example, or even the last year, although the vehicle miles of travel maybe has not increased that much or has plateaued, if you take population in consideration, yes, then the vehicle miles of travel per capita is actually going down.
So why is that? What's going on here? I mean, what are the factors that are contributing to that? Is this just the recession? People don't have the money to travel like they used to? Or?
I think initially we did think it was a recession, but when we look at the data, we see that behavior is changing. Demographics are changing. We look at people working at home, not commuting, for example. We look at the number of people in the workforce. We're actually down. I think it was 67% of the workforce was people were working. Now it's down to 63%. We look at people actually, they have less interest, especially younger people, in purchasing a car. We look at there's less people that have cars, less people that have two-car families. But the other thing we see is that we see an increase in and an interest in other modes of transportation. In other words, while people are actually using their auto less, they're actually using their bicycles more, they're using transit more. And another important factor here is that about 80% of the population is in urban areas or living in urban areas. So that's where we have the ability to put in bike lanes, put in bike paths, and use transit.
And we're seeing more and more people choosing to live now in those kinds of locations where they have the access. Isn't that correct?
Correct. Look at Madison. Look at all the new development that we're having in the middle of the urban area. So how do you serve that? It's much cheaper, and people really want to use alternative modes. They don't want to use an automobile.
So what do you think it's going to take for sort of the state and federal machinery to get it? And you know, one of the things I found interesting is that you mentioned that private enterprise is starting to get it, and they seem to be ahead of the curve from at least as far as the government's concerned.
They are. In fact, I think Ford Motor Company hired a futurist, for example. But they are starting to team with some of the car share programs. Daimler, Chrysler.
What's a car share program?
It's like in Madison. We have community car. And that's where you actually have a service where a group of people actually share in the use of an automobile. So it's parked in one location, you have a membership, and you pay per use, or you pay per mile of use, or you pay per hour of use. And in populated areas, like particularly New York and Washington, D.C., we see those just proliferating. And the interesting thing is that the statistics say that for each car that's put into a car share service, you sell anywhere between the number of automobiles sold goes down 18 to 20 per car put into a car share service. So you can imagine that's not in the best interest of the automobile industry, but I think they see the change in the landscape. because auto sales have gone down.
So they're investing in these car share.
They're investing in these car share services because they're a good outlet for their cars. Plus, they see this trend going down, and they are actually selling less automobiles than they did previously.
And I think you mentioned that in Germany, was it, that bicycle sales outnumbered car sales?
Well, actually, in the EU, which is 26 countries, in 25 of those 26 countries, bicycle sales in the last year outperformed automobile sales. So we're seeing a trend there, and a lot of things that happen in Europe eventually get to the United States.
So do you see any sign that folks in, say, Wisconsin Department of Transportation or the federal highways are starting to pay attention to this? I mean, we've seen in the last budget we're still talking about lane expansions on I-94. Did they just have their head in the sand or what?
Well, I will give some credit. The governor did last year in 2013. He did put together a task force to look at this whole revenue issue. How should we fund our gas tax has not increased. What should we do about raising revenue for transportation? And he did put a task force together, and they came out with I thought were some good ideas, but of course, they're just sitting there. Nobody is acting on those.
Yeah, like what? What were some of the ideas?
Well, one of the ideas that they're talking about now is a user fee rather than a gas tax, which is somewhat equitable, not really equitable. It would be similar to a toll road. Oregon is doing great work in actually testing some of these, but you actually don't have a toll road. But people keep track, there's various ways you do, of the vehicle miles of travel that they have each year, and then they pay based on how many miles they use, rather than a gas tax. And it also takes into consideration, for example, trucks, which do a lot more damage on roads. It takes that into consideration, too. So you have a vehicle mile or you have a vehicle mile ton tax rate. So that's one of the things that's really coming to the forefront. And that was investigated, I think, as part of the research that was done by this task force. But there's been...
How is that done? Is that done through surveillance?
Well, it comes down to a privacy issue. But, when you go and sell your car, you have to tell them what the odometer reading is. This could be something similar. It could be something that you report voluntarily. That may not work very well. It could be an apparatus that is in your car. With the electronics today, it could be something that's actually incorporated in the car, and then every month it's radio, or it goes over the internet to the DOT, and then they bill you out, accordingly. Oregon's been working on looking at these different ways to do that over the last couple of years. So there's some states that are way ahead of the curve.
And obviously we need to invest. You would argue that we would need to invest in other forms of transportation as well. So, well, that seems to be where the demand is.
We're a free market system. Why are we investing in something that's going down in usage? You want to really be ahead of the curve. And you want to be investing in those modes of transportation that are actually the people want.
All right. Well, we've been speaking with John Lichtenheld. He's a principal designer and planner with the SAA Design Group. Thanks so much for joining us on the 8 o'clock bus.
Thanks, Brian.